welcome to the first panel. It's a plenary panel for once on writing Europe's eastern border, and this is a panel that basically combines two of the themes of our project, both the Mapping Europe theme of the first part of the project and the Acts of Unsettling, which is the third section of our project as well. And two different kinds of paper, one that looks more at Eastern Europe and one that looks at Eastern Europe in the West. So it represents some of the currents of the project as a whole. So we're going to have roughly 20-minute papers to start with, and then we'll have a Q&A at the end. Okay, so save your questions. So it's a pleasure to introduce Uilleam Blacker, who hasn't come very far today. He's come from UCL. University College London, so apparently not too much of a problem in terms of Storm Doris. And the title of his paper is Mapping Europe's Periphery, Ukraine as a Space of Minor Literature. So over to you.
Thank you very much. So what I'm going to talk to you about today is kind of the beginnings of a research project. So it's sort of tentative first steps. So I'm probably going to be asking more questions than giving answers, so I kind of apologize for that. Already from the beginning. It's also something that I really have to get my head around, because I'm teaching a course based on all this starting next year. So, I'm really sort of trying to get to grips with the kind of conceptual framework and how I can look at this and how I can convey it to students as well. So I'll be really grateful for your feedback afterwards. So first I want to talk a little bit about Ukraine as a landscape of minor and minority literatures and the sort of complexities of that. I'll probably be throwing a lot of names at you, so I apologize for that. But I think most of them you will actually know. Then ask, as I said, a few questions about how to think about this, how to conceptualize this complexity. So first of all, Ukrainian literature, of course, like most national literatures, is generally conceptualized as literature in the national language, in Ukrainian. But of course, as in many cases, national self-identification of writers doesn't always match up to language use. So probably the most famous Ukrainian writer that people will know is Nikolai Gogol, Mykola Hohol in Ukrainian. So a writer who wrote everything he ever wrote was in Russian, apart from one short note that he once wrote to a friend. It's the only thing that's been found that he wrote in Ukrainian. But he did speak Ukrainian. He felt sort of split between Ukrainian and Russian cultural identities. He wrote about Ukraine and he wrote about being Ukrainian and being Russian. So he's in between, but he writes in Russian. Ukraine's national poet, so if we know Gogol maybe as the most prominent Ukrainian writer, although not everybody realizes that he's Ukrainian. In Ukraine, much more important is Taras Shevchenko, the 19th century romantic national poet, who is best known for writing in the Ukrainian language, for being the kind of creator of the Ukrainian literary language, as in the cases of many kind of national poets. But he also wrote prose, and almost all of that was written in Russian. And he also wrote diaries in Russian. So he's a bilingual writer, in fact. And these kind of cases, we can find these kind of bilingual Russian-Ukrainian cases right throughout the whole history of Ukrainian literature. Some of you might have read the Ukrainian writer Andrei Kurkov, who wrote quite a successful book called Death and the Penguin, sort of about 10, 15 years ago. Anyway, he's been fairly popular in sort of English translation, but he's a writer who writes everything in Russian but identifies as Ukrainian. So there's the matchup between language and sort of self-identification is complicated. Of course, not all writers who wrote in Russian and came from Ukraine self-identified as Ukrainian. So it's the next level of sort of complexity. A writer like Gogol was very typical of the sort of Ukrainian cultural elites of his period, the early 19th century, who felt a kind of connection to a Ukrainian past, spoke Ukrainian. But as you move through the 19th century, Ukraine's cultural elites become more Russified due to sort of assimilation into Russian culture, due to migration processes within the Russian Empire. particularly urban elites become much more Russified. And that produces writers who feel very much part of Russian literature and feel that they have very little to do with Ukrainian literature. Yeah? Probably the most famous example would be Bulgakov. So Bulgakov, a writer who's from Kiev, who spent most of his youth in Ukraine, but certainly didn't feel that he was part of Ukrainian culture in any way and isn't considered as such. And we can even find sort of a certain attitude of disdain towards Ukrainian language and culture in some of Bulgakov's work. And there are a lot of examples like this, from Anna Akhmatova, for example, who's from Ukraine. Originally, Konstantin Paustovsky, a writer that some people may have heard of as well. More recent, Edward Limonov, sort of infamous sort of nationalist politician more recently as well. Originally from Ukraine, but very much a Russian nationalist. Next level of complexity, given that Ukraine represented the largest part of the Pale of Settlement in the Russian Empire, it produced a lot of Jewish writers, many of whom wrote in the Russian language. So we could talk about Isaac Babel from Odessa, Vasily Grossman from central Ukraine, for example, Ilya Ehrenburg, none of whom would have considered themselves part of Ukrainian literature. They've been part of Russian literature, first and foremost. Of course, Jewish literature of this region is not restricted to the Russian language. So there are some Jewish writers who've written in Ukrainian, quite few, but there are some in the Soviet period and the post-Soviet period. But mostly from the region, Jewish writers are writing in Russian or in Yiddish or in Hebrew. So probably the most famous example being Sholem Aleichem from central Ukraine again. That's just Ukraine under Russian imperial or Soviet rule. Of course, there's Western Ukraine, which comes under rule from Moscow only after the Second World War. And before that is part of Poland, although pockets of it are in Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania. And before the First World War, it's the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And here again, there's lots of linguistic complexities in literary production. So within Ukrainian literature, one of the most important late 19th century writers, a writer called Ivan Franko, wrote first in German, then in Polish, before deciding to become a Ukrainian language writer. Ukraine's first feminist writer, a writer called Olha Kobylanska, who came from Chernivtsi, Czernowitz, who was born in a village that's today in Romania, but she lived most of her life in Chernivtsi, of Ukrainian, Polish, German ancestry, and wrote in Ukrainian and also in German, and sort of considered herself to be part of sort of two literary spheres. Western Ukraine is also the site of an important site of literary activity in other languages. So there's Polish literature. Stanisław Lem, for example, the author of Solaris, comes from Polish Lwów, today Ukrainian Lviv. Leopold von Sacher-Masoch, the Austrian writer, comes from the same region. Josef Roth from Brody in Western Ukraine, writing in German. Bruno Schulz, the famous Polish Jewish modernist, writing in Polish, obviously. The Shmuel Yosef Agnon, winner of the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1966, from a small town called Buchach in Western Ukraine, writing in Yiddish. And finally, the last bit of the jigsaw would be Crimean Tatar literature. Yeah, so important Crimean Tatar writers who are very difficult to find in translation. Eshrem Shemi Zadeh, Shamil Eliadin, probably names that people won't have heard of, but important to the Crimean Tatar sort of national culture and literature. They are also sort of part of the literary heritage of the territory of today's Ukraine. Okay, so that's the complicated bit. How is all this understood and received in Ukraine today? Well, it's worth looking at the school curriculum in this regard. Literature in Ukrainian schools is taught in two subjects, Ukrainian literature and foreign literature. Gogol, for example, is studied in both. So he's a Ukrainian writer and he's also a foreign writer. Studied theoretically in Ukrainian translation, although I think a lot of students are reading him in the original. because the vast majority of Ukrainians speak Russian and read it as well. The Ukrainian literature is obviously overwhelmingly focused on Ukrainian language literature. There is some kind of provision within the curriculum for an understanding of writers who wrote in, not just in Ukrainian. Yeah, so there's sort of study of Shevchenko's Russian works, for example, but it's quite it's a pretty small part of the curriculum. Foreign literature is very broad, so there's literature from sort of all around the world, from sort of the beginning to the end. Although it's focused mainly on Western European literature, there's also a strong Russian element in it. Writers on the foreign literature curriculum include Bulgakov, Akhmatova, Shalom Aleichem. The links to Ukraine are sort of mentioned in the curriculum program, and I'm referring to the school curriculums which you can find on the Ukrainian Ministry of Education website. But nevertheless, this is part of foreign literature. There is, the national curriculum does have a special elective course on Jewish culture and history, which covers some Jewish writers from Ukraine, but it's a much broader course. So the course is not focused on, let's say, our Jewish heritage, or the Jewish heritage of Ukraine. Sort of, those writers who were working in Ukraine are part of a bigger story. And I should probably also mention that there are official minority languages within Ukraine, quite a lot of them, and for each of those there's a sort of literary curriculum on the national curriculum. So for Russian literature, Polish, Crimean Tatar, Romanian, Hungarian, a couple more. So the school program recognizes some linguistic diversity among Ukrainian writers. It covers some non-ethnic Ukrainian writers who wrote in today's Ukraine. There's quite a lot of attention paid to, in the Ukrainian literature part, to sort of Russian-Ukrainian relations, obviously because a lot of this is literature written in the Russian Empire, and there's a sort of anti-colonial subtext to all this. But it doesn't conceptualize all this kind of diversity as part of any kind of common literary process. Which means that some of the most important writers who lived and worked on the territory of what's today Ukraine, like for example Bruno Schulz, are completely absent. Some others like Babel, Bialik, Agnon are kind of part of a very sort of limited specialist subject. The foreign literature program does, in its kind of theoretical preamble, does sort of foresee a comparative literary frameworks, but there's no kind of consideration of how that might be applied to the specific Ukrainian context. Now it's easy to sort of sit here and say, well, yes, of course, Ukraine should be more open to its kind of diverse multicultural heritage, its diverse sort of literary heritage. But what's important to remember here is that for many Ukrainians, Ukrainian literature feels as if it itself is a minority literature, even within Ukraine. There's still a sense that after, essentially a couple of centuries of existence under conditions of imperialism under the Russian Empire, but also under the Austro-Hungarian Empire, under Poland, that Ukrainian literature is still recovering from a long history of repression. And that threat is still felt as continuing in the dominance of the Russian language in Ukrainian media. So Ukrainian TV, radio, press is still dominated by the Russian language. Ukrainian book publishing, so something like up to 80% of books on sale in Ukraine are in Russian. And so all of this leaves the impression that Ukrainian literature is still really struggling within its own state. So Ukraine then, and to refer back to Pascal Casanova, which we heard about already this morning, is one of those sort of literatures on the periphery, which is always in sort of, tense antagonistic relations with geocultural centres and aware of its own precarious position. This makes it difficult for Ukrainian literature to kind of open itself to questioning, to fragmentation, possibly to dilution, through the accommodation of diverse alternative traditions, especially when one of those is Russian literature. Consolidation, self-preservation, these are still the sort of priorities of Ukrainian culture, of Ukrainian literature. Sharing cultural resources is difficult. It feels difficult in that situation. But I think that it's possible to think of it in a slightly different way. It's possible to think of this diverse heritage in a way that would maybe help Ukrainian literature in that situation. If we look beyond Russian literature to the diverse other literatures that are present in the territory of Ukraine, we find several minor literary traditions, minority literary traditions, Ukrainian, Yiddish, Tatar, which are all kind of involved in the same fight, as it were, but not with each other. So there's a sense of a sort of common, perhaps a common sense of common smallness. Might be drawn on as a source of solidarity and a useful point of departure for sort of intra-Ukrainian comparative perspectives, as it were. And there's a long history of Ukrainian writers and intellectuals, for example, drawing parallels between Ukrainians and Jews in their struggle for self-determination. More recently, those kind of parallels are being drawn, spoken about in relation to the Crimean Tatars, especially in the light of the annexation of Crimea by Russia. This has become something that is very visible and prominent. With Polish literature, it's kind of more complicated, because in a sense, Ukrainian literature in the 19th, early 20th centuries is in a sort of similar situation in the western part of Ukraine as it is in relation to Russian literature in the eastern part. But thinking more broadly, I think it would also be possible to think of Polish and Ukrainian literature both in terms of these kind of precarious but dynamic minority literatures that have struggled with cultural imperialism and threatened nationhood. Ukraine is also an interesting, provides interesting examples of minor literatures in the sense that Deleuze and Guattari use in relation to Kafka. So literature written from within the major language but soaked through with the languages and cultures of the periphery. Jewish writers like Joseph Roth, Bruno Schulz, Isaac Babel could fall into this category, performing this function in relation to German language literature, Polish literature, Russian literature. The works of all three of these are inflected by sort of linguistic and cultural specifics of the periphery of the borderland. But this doesn't only apply to Jewish writers. I think Gogol, for example, is an example of something we can interpret as a tradition of Ukrainian Russophone minor literature. It's something which hasn't really been, I don't think, explored in the scholarship on Gogol. So we could look at Ukraine as a territory where several big literary traditions are subjected to processes of becoming minor. A process that again could be studied usefully in comparative perspective within the context of Ukraine. What similarities are there between Bruno Schulz's relationship with the Polish literary tradition and Gogol's relationship with the Russian literary tradition? Are there sort of useful parallels? I spoke about the sort of limitations of the school curriculum, but it would be wrong to suggest that all of this situation I've been describing is entirely unnoticed in Ukraine. Russophone Ukrainian literature is continually the subject of quite tense debates, quite intense debates. There's a lot of resistance to recognizing Russophone literature as part of Ukrainian literature, but I think increasingly we see more and more voices arguing for a vision of a bilingual culture, and also for arguing for the existence of a kind of separate Ukrainian Russophone literary tradition. We've also, in recent years in Ukraine, there's been an increasing awareness of the sort of wider richness of the culture of the country's cultural heritage, and within that its literary heritage as well. So there are a number of, for example, festivals dedicated to some of the writers that I've been describing. There's a festival every 2 years dedicated to Bruno Schulz in the small town that he lived in Western Ukraine. There's another in Chernivtsi, which is inspired by the work of Paul Celan, who was born in that city. It's a very small town of Buchach now has a cultural centre dedicated to Agnon. Kiev's Bulgakov Museum is probably one of the main tourist attractions there, and remains extremely popular. And the city now has a Sholem Aleichem museum, which was opened in 2009. A recent exhibit in the Kiev City Museum is another good example. It told the city's history through the lives and works of Russian, Ukrainian and Jewish writers and intellectuals who were from the city or worked in the city. So that included Bulgakov, Sholem Aleichem, Pushkin, and the Ukrainian historian Mikhailo Hrushevsky. So useful here to return again to Casanova, who, while again recognizing the reliance of literary traditions on national political factors, on nation states, argues for this separate, autonomous existence of literature in a kind of interconnected global system. Literature's existing not as isolated and emanations of national characters, but in relationships of sort of mutually defining rivalry. Now, I think there are certain limitations to the idea in relation to the small literatures, but I think it could be usefully deployed in the narrower context of contemporary Ukraine, a kind of world republic of letters in one country, as it were. But the key to this, I think, would be in reducing the scale much further. So from the global to the national, and even further to the local level. So in the Ukrainian school program for Ukrainian literature, there are, at every level, there are several lessons set aside for literature of my native region, so-called, which aims to instill in students, and I'm quoting, a respectful attitude towards artists from their region as particularly gifted people, as bards of their native land. This is the kind of language that's used. Now, almost anywhere in Ukraine, it's possible to find among the bards of one's native region those who wrote in multiple languages. So it might be that the most locally focused of approaches could in fact reveal the broadest and most open understanding of literary heritage and provide a way of integrating it into wider school curriculum, and through that more generally into the literary consciousness of contemporary Ukrainians. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Uilleam, for your paper. I can actually see it fitting very well with the readership and circulation section as well. So we're going to have to fight to put you in one particular section. Thank you so much for your paper. Next up is Pamela McCallum, who's come from farther away than Uilleam. She's come from the University of Calgary in Canada. It may be that she can't go back in this current weather. The title of her paper is Representing the East Working in the West, Marina Lewycka's Two Caravans. So over to you, Pamela. Thank you so much.
Thanks. So I know you come from very different backgrounds, and if you don't know the work of Marina Lewycka, or if you don't know her context, I'll just begin by saying that she is a writer of Ukrainian parentage. Her parents came to Britain at the end of the Second World War. And she was actually born in a displaced persons camp, but she came to Britain when she was a very small child. So she has, in effect, lived all her life in the Midlands of England, but with connections to Ukrainian communities there. So in her novels about the Ukraine and other Eastern European immigrants to Britain, A Short History of Tractors in the Ukraine, and Two Caravans, published in North America as Strawberry Fields. It's very confusing to, to have two titles for the same novel, but I understand why Two Caravans wouldn't be seen as a novel title in North America. But in these texts, Marina Lewycka has created a body of writing that explores the experience of migrants from the East working in the West. The narratives of Two Caravans articulate a world of globalized labor, where a business styling itself as human solutions imports workers for factory farming, agricultural work, care homes, food processing, and other services. By telling the stories of those who enter the United Kingdom with visas or European Union status, the three Polish characters, Yola, Martha, and Tomas, two Chinese, Sulai Bei and Son Ying, and those who are undocumented, the two Ukrainians, Irina and Andreev, and the African Emmanuel. Two Caravans constructs a space where the exchange of human bodies for labor can take place legally when an English farmer hires EU nationals, or in the shadier spaces of globalization where migrant workers are trafficked and young women might be targets for the sex trade. The characters in Two Caravans are positioned between national cultures that have shaped their lives and the global movement of labor from impoverished regions of the former Soviet Union to Western Europe and the United Kingdom. In telling the stories of Eastern Europeans in England, I want to suggest Lewycka articulates a minor literature both within the contemporary English novel and within literatures of migration. My focus will be on the use of language in Two Caravans and on the strategies of representation that circulate around the Ukrainian characters, Irina and Andreev. A 19-year-old woman from Kiev who expects to go on to university studies, and a young man from Donetsk, the coal mining area in eastern Ukraine, who has seen his father die in a mine collapse. In addition to the representations of the Ukrainian nation, they're allegorical characters in this sense. So on the one hand, the large urban area seeking connection with Europe, and on the other, the eastern borderlands oriented towards Russia. The journey to England situates Irina and Andreev between two empires, Ukraine's past affiliations to the failed Soviet Union and the Eastern European bloc, and Britain's historical memory of worldwide empire, replaced by a globalized economy highly reliant on service industries, zero-hour contracts, and a migrant workforce. In his book, New Slaveries in Contemporary British Literature and Visual Arts, Pietro D'Andrea builds on journalist Cao Hung Pai's investigations into the lives of undocumented migrants from China working in Britain to focus on the figure of the ghost as a poignant metaphor for those leading spectral lives that do not have access to an official public sphere. He locates literature and visual arts as spaces where these, this is D'Andrea, ghostly humans are given flesh and blood by narratives and artworks that challenge readers and viewers to come face to face with the lived density of lives that are often hidden from view but are crucial in harvesting the myriad vegetables, fruit, and other food available in supermarkets, cleaning spaces where people live, work, and traverse, preparing and serving hundreds and thousands of meals in restaurant kitchens, and so on. I could go on for a long time. As if to highlight this invisibility of undocumented workers, Lewycka's strawberry pickers, often like Kafka's Kay standing before the castle, find themselves without names, even among their own small group. Jola, the Polish supervisor, refers to Sulai B and Song Ying as the two Chinese girls because she can never get the hang of their names. Elsewhere, in the hellish chicken factory farm, Thomas introduces himself, adding, "My friends call me Tomek." He receives the answer, Tom, Mick, whatever. Mind if I just call you Mick? And in a sobering note to her excited arrival in England, Irina finds herself addressed repeatedly by the alarming black-jacketed Balkan gangster Volk, who meets her in Dover as Little Flover, a mispronunciation of flower, and a generic diminutive that stresses the interchangeability of all the young women he has trafficked into the sex trade. In each of these instances, the loss of individual names underscores the migrants' invisibility within the labor economies and the larger social spaces they inhabit. For Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari, language takes on broader significations in the forms of minor literature. Kafka's Prague German, and I'm grateful for your comments on this as well, inflected with Yiddish and Czech, becomes, in their words, deterritorialized, pressed out of its zones of familiarity, and appropriated for strange and minor uses. In a similar way, Lewycka's two Caravans deforms and restructures English in the narratives of the migrants. Her strategy is never to produce broken English in an attempt to represent realistically the voices of Chinese or African or Eastern European characters. Rather, the language of the novel dismantles and reassembles English in order to draw attention to the unique inflections within both the speech of individuals and the collectivity of the migrant community. Distinctive uses of English often underline an excess of affect circulating in and through relations of hierarchy and modes of domination. And I've got two examples here. Shortly after her arrival at the strawberry farm, Irina reflects on her fondness for studying the English language in school, recalling her linguistically inspired imaginary constructions of the country. So this is Irina. I had pictured myself walking through a panorama of cultivated conversations, like a painted landscape dotted with intriguing homonyms and mysterious subjunctives. Would you were wooed in the wood. This remembered pronunciation exercise, with its subjunctive form, a form largely unused in contemporary spoken English, and its archaic diction, wooed, articulates Irina's desire for romance at the same time that it ironically anticipates her terrifying experience when Volt chases her through the forests of Kent, attempting to abduct her for the sex trade. Just as the phrase expresses past and present longings, her love of the English language, her desire to meet the English men and women she has created in her imagination, it also inscribes a future nightmare concretized by global networks of exploitation. Later in the novel, the dangers facing Irina are refracted in a condensed but expressive neologism through which Emmanuel conveys the desperation he and Andreev feel when they fear Irina may have disappeared. When Andreev confronts Volk in Dover, Emmanuel writes, Andrei, he's spelling it Andree, ask him the where-being of the beauteous strawberry picker Irina. In reading this sentence only for the meaning, it's simple to substitute whereabouts, or a phrasing such as where Irina is, but to do so would lose the dense resonance of where-being. With its existential connotations, being suggests the two men's concerns for the health, security, and safety of Irina, her well-being. She has, in fact, endured a harrowing flight from Volk, spent a fearful night hiding in the forest, followed sounds of traffic to a road, and joined another group of strawberry pickers. So she is relatively safe. Although neither Andreev nor Emmanuel know of any of her disturbing experiences, the resonance of where-being distinctly evokes their anxieties about what might happen to a young undocumented woman alone in England whose disappearance is not likely to be noticed by authorities. This is the invisibility. This is the sense in which minor literature, according to Deleuze and Guattari, becomes a space saturated with the political. Whereas in the novels of major literature, the focus remains on the development of individual characters. In those of minor literature, this is Deleuze and Guattari again, cramped space forces each individual intrigue to connect immediately to politics. They go on to claim the individual concern thus becomes all the more necessary, indispensable, magnified, because a whole other story is vibrating within it. If Lewycka's novel tells the story of Ukrainian, Polish, Chinese, Malawian, and other nationalities who have entered Britain seeking work in the agricultural sector, it is not surprising that representations of global migration, privatization of social services, English language schools that exist primarily to provide student visas, transformation of agriculture into factory farming, disparities of wealth between rural and urban areas and between East and West, environmental degradation and protests against it, together with the secret illegal underside of globalization, human smuggling and trafficking, all crowd into the novel's narrative. Now, there is an influential argument grouped around critics like Martha Nussbaum that reading literature makes possible an experience of otherness, expanding ethical capacities and opening up possibilities of empathy. While there can be no doubt that such an affect of literature offers an enlargement of human potential, in his 2014 book, The Deliverance of Others, Reading Literature in a Global Age, David Palumbo-Liu opens up a series of further questions. How much otherness confounds us, he asks, rather than enriches us? How different can their lot be from ours before it recedes into unintelligibility? In other words, is there an otherness that cannot be surmounted by the representational strategies of literature? Palumbo Lu continues on to comment that readers become caught in an oscillating movement, identifying and de-identifying, weighing what we can and cannot learn from, and advocates moving away from a concentration on meaning making to reflect instead on how literature engenders a space for imagining our relation to others and thinking through how and why that relation exists, historically, politically, ideologically. Such a strategy, he argues, underscores the constructedness of relations to otherness, emphasizing how they draw from, and this is Palumbo Lu again, a number of complex and often contradictory forces, some that draw us closer, others that drive us apart. So one example that I think points out what he's saying here. Through Andreev's search for Marina, two caravans stages a confrontation that articulates the issues and questions Palumbo Lu has raised. On the site of another strawberry farm, Andreev discovers Volk with a young woman, Lena. Struck by her youth, she looks no older than 15 to him, but she claims she's 17. Andreev reaches out to her. "Little sister, you come with me. This is no good for you. I take you back to Strawberry Place." A concern he repeats several times during their brief confrontation. Confounded by her blank, unfathomable eyes that hover halfway between fear and contempt, Andreev's gestures toward mutual recognition, speaking in Ukrainian, using the familiar sister as address, fail in the face of an otherness that the multiply abused Lena aggressively asserts. You think you know everything, what you know about life for woman in Yasignar. This belligerent retort represents what Palumbo Lu calls true and formidable otherness, disruptively rejecting Andreev's assumptions of commonality on national and metaphorically familial grounds, and it elicits from him an equally antagonistic response. He wishes he could just grab her with both hands and shake her, shake that pathetic smile off her face, shake the deadness out of her eyes. What is happening to his country? It is becoming a human wasteland. Violence met with desire for more violence. This small mise en scène seems to have moved all too quickly from empathetic disquiet to intractable opposition. And yet, Andreev's reflection, what is happening to his country, opens up a line of questioning that begins from local conventions of patriarchy, where sexual access to a 12-year-old girl is overlooked, passes through an economy of trafficking in which a teenage girl is constructed as an object to be bought and sold, and reaches towards the transformations of the economies of Eastern Europe after 1989 and the breakup of the Soviet Union. Andreev's question cannot be answered without considering the new modes of domination and subjection that characterize global economies, that set migrants on long journeys in search of labor, and that empty out former zones of industry to silent, vacant spaces. With a simple question in the mind of a young Ukrainian, Two Caravans opens into a larger interrogation of the transformation of labor in a globalized world, a whole other story, to use Deleuze and Guattari's phrasing, vibrating within this conversation in a field somewhere in southeast England. Thank you.